All right, so I just wanted to share with you, first off, that I took an informal poll yesterday when I gave over the halacha about the tenant who left the water heater on, the electric water heater on when he vacated the premises. And I asked people after davening how many people thought that the tenant was liable. No hands went up. And how many people think the landlord was liable because he did a walkthrough at the end of the tenancy. And most people thought that the landlord was more liable. So as you can tell, this is a very subjective question because the switch, the switch for turning on and off the water heater is not a conspicuous thing, right? And its level of conspicuousness, or how much the landlord should have checked to make sure that the switch was off, is very subjective. And I'm glad that we had a chance to see that tshuva from Rav Wasner inside, because it sort of indicated his thinking process, which is not at all simple to extrapolate to other scenarios. So you can see how sometimes even the tiniest little detail could turn the halacha upside down. Okay, here's another scenario. Hameki ochlo, the hizik al yedezeh kelev shel chavero. Not a very pleasant scene, but a person vomits and accidentally vomits all over his friend and ends up ruining his clothing. It's like it's totally ruined. Is the vomiter liable? Nira lanias daiti, the imyachol lihistovev hatzida chayav. So it seems to me that if he could have turned to the side and he didn't, so then he's going to be liable. The imhunena su patur. But if there was no way, it was in a completely instantaneous vomiting, so then he will be patur. Uvederech klal adam margish rega kodem sheholech lahaki umemela ein zaonis. But he says in general, it would seem to me that people can tell a moment before they vomit that they're about to vomit, and so therefore it's not an onus. I don't know. I hope that's never happened to anybody, but I guess it's yesterday. My son told me just by coincidence that there was a boy who threw up on the camp bus yesterday, and so that's one of those things that we all remember, is someone vomited on the bus and the whole bus stank to high heaven. So who's responsible if there's damage to the bus? I'm sure that every camp bus driver has a vomit story. So what do you do? That's part of the occupational hazard. Okay. Echad ba lahatzil kli zuchuches yikarim shel chaveru mehadlega b'sam otam b'sak. Okay, here's another scenario. A person was noticed that his friend's house was on fire. So he ran into the house to save some of his friend's belongings, and he noticed that there was some fine crystal. So he puts the fine crystal in a bag. B'toch kedei halichato lahanicham rachok me'ha'esh, nishmat hasak miyado v'nishberu hakelim. And as he's running out of the house, unfortunately, he drops the sack and the crystal crashes. So what a noble guy running into a burning house to save the crystal, and he ends up destroying the crystal. So in that situation, chayav behezekam, he is liable, and he's quoting a very early source for this halacha. And so again, it's a really interesting thing. There, I would imagine in certain instances there are probably good Samaritan laws. If you're being a good Samaritan because you're trying to help your friend, and then in the course of doing that, you end up damaging. I know that there are good Samaritan laws in most in most places in the world. For example, if a person is trying to save someone's life and in the course of doing it, they damage their clothing, right? So then I don't think that they can be held liable for any damage. If a person does CPR and they end up cracking some ribs in order to revive the person, I think that, I know in the US, it's probably true in Canada as well. Maybe Joby, you can help us. Can he be held? Can he be sued for that kind of action? Are there good Samaritan laws here?
Absolutely. But in terms of like a situation where somebody truly collapses and somebody does CPR and they end up with cracked ribs, I think that's all part, I'm pretty sure that is all part of saving the person, and there's no recourse after that. Um, they would be patur from breaking ribs under that circumstance. On the other hand, if they actually, were not, they were doing everything improperly, they may have a case against them afterwards. The person really wasn't unconscious. They weren't really checked properly. And the heart really was beating and they didn't check for a pulse and they started doing CPR and started cracking ribs. I don't think you can hold this Good Samaritan card there.
Right. So it all depends on the level of expertise. It's probably the same thing when it comes to malpractice as well. If the physician did everything that was within their power and they just lost the patient, so then that's one thing. If they did not know what they were doing, they were not well prepared, and they committed a true error, so then they can be held liable. Okay.
Rabbi, I'm curious about the crystal case. If the crystal would have got destroyed in any case in the fire, then why would he be held liable? Because he tried to save it and it got destroyed at his hand.
I mean, that's a valid question. I guess the argument would be maybe it wouldn't have gotten destroyed. Maybe someone else could have gone in to save the crystal and might have been able to be less of a klutz about it. So the fact that this guy dropped the bag, makes him, more subject to liability. I suppose it would also depend on the scenario.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
More facts required. We have, I think it's called What If. We go through this book on Shabbos. It has a lot of these kinds of cases, and oftentimes the questions we have are, we need more information, or we don't.
Is that's Rabbi Zilberstein, I think,
correct?
Right? Yeah,
correct.
We have the same one. Yeah. I also say that we need more information.
Yeah.
Okay. Next case. Misha hayayim chavero bamalon. The haya leechad davar echad. Ubetoch oto davar hayalo kli shel zechuchit. So, two people are in a hotel. One of them has a container, and in that container there is a crystal object. V'natlo ha'acher kidei leishev ba'oto makom. And so his friend moves that object. Let's say it's a box, and the box is on a chair, and his friend moves the box because he wants to sit on the chair. V'nafal hazuchuchit mitocho v'nishbar. And the crystal falls out of the box as he's moving it, and it breaks. So, chayav l'shalem. So in that situation, the person who moved the box has to pay. Again, this is from an early source. Why? Because he should have thought to himself, maybe there's something fragile in here. In other words, you shouldn't move boxes or packages with disregard towards their contents. Hu hadin b'mikva shehanichu b'haba'olim et shinav atotavot bein begadav. So here's another example of the same kind of situation. A guy goes to the mikveh. A lot of Hasidim go to the mikveh daily, and he puts his false teeth, his dentures, in the pocket of one of his articles of clothing that he's hung up in the mikveh in order to be able to go to the mikveh. Uba chavero behezizis begadav lefanot la'atzmo makom. And his friend comes along and moves his friend's clothing in order to make room for his own stuff. And in the course of moving the guy's clothes, vinaflu vinishperu, the dentures fall out of the pocket and they end up breaking. So who's liable to pay for the dentures? So again, if you moved my stuff, all right, I'm not going to begrudge you for moving my clothing because you need space. But in the course of moving it, you end up breaking something. So then you're liable to pay. It's all under the same genre of category. It's interesting, I can think of a number of different instances. Let's say we're davening and you want to move my tefillin, and my tefillin bag so that you can make room for your stuff. Well, it could be that I have a mirror in my tefillin bag. I might have other breakable items that are in my tefillin bag that I'm usually careful about. If you move my stuff and you don't give consideration to the fact that there might be something breakable in there, then you can be held liable. Okay. All right. Another interesting tshuva, sofer shekasav betos b'makom masayim mana potter, a scribe who accidentally writes the wrong amount in the ketubah. He is going to be exempt if they go ahead with the ketubah, and it turns out that the woman ended up receiving less than what she was entitled to. Why is he going to be potter? Presumably because a scribe is there to provide the wording, but it's really the responsibility of the two parties that are entering into the contract to read the contract before they sign, before they enact whatever transaction that the shtar is going to be enacting. So that's the reason why he's potter. Okay, next. Poel shehizik toch kedei malachto bedavar acher. Ein shum tzad lechayev et ba'al habayit. He says a worker goes ahead and in the course of his workday ends up causing damage. But it's not even the damage of the property of the person that he's working for. Let's say he damages someone else's property. So who is the liable party in that case? Is it his employer, or is it the person himself who caused the damage? So he quotes, what's he quoting from over here? He's talking about Pischei Choshen, which is a general sefer, a contemporary sefer. He says, "Ein shum tzad lechayev et habal habayit." There's no room here to in any way find the employer liable. De'eza shmira mutelas ala bal habayis b'ma'asav shel hapoel. How can you expect the employer to control the actions of the employee? Now here, well, you may argue there's not enough information here. What if the employer is telling his employees to engage in hazardous activity? What if he's telling them to do something near a public thoroughfare, which is potentially hazardous? There's laws, let's say, that exist in most societies that if you're going to be working with a jackhammer, you have to put up those orange pylons all around you to cordon off the area to make sure that the public is protected. Well, what if the employer didn't require that of his employees? Or there could be a number of different scenarios where these are unskilled laborers and the employer took chances with something that really requires more skill in order to protect the area around where they're working. But he says, as a general rule, you cannot hold the employer liable. The im hizik b'davar shekashur la'avodaso. But if the employee causes damage in a way that the damage was a direct result of his work product, kigon shahayatzarech likdoa chur b'kir mishutaf, v'gorem al yedzei dzeh nezek lashachen. So, for example, the employee was charged with drilling a hole in the wall, a common wall, between two neighbors. And as a result of the work that he was doing, he caused damage to his neighbor's property. Okay, which is a very prevalent thing to do. You're doing work, let's say, in an apartment building, and you're a plumber, and you end up, or some other kind of laborer, and you end up causing damage to, let's say, the neighbor that's just below, downstairs, or just upstairs, because you make a mistake and you end up causing damage. Then, in certain instances, we might hold the employer liable if this was part of the work product of the employee, because the employer may have done something improper by hiring this guy or giving him instructions to engage in a certain activity that was hazardous. So when the employee causes damage not related to the work that he was doing, so then the employer certainly cannot be held liable. But if the damage is caused in the course of doing the work that he was hired to do by the employer, so then there's more room to say that the employer could be held liable. But there's no parameters provided over here. And again, every case like this would have to be very carefully analyzed. And I'm sure there's a lot of labor law and tort law which has to drill down into these very complex cases, I would imagine. Okay. And then we'll do the last two pieces of the Likutim to finish off Sif Aleph.
I'm just going to suggest that question is important because sometimes the laborer doesn't have pockets from which to extract compensation, and the employer with whom you contracted does. So if you say, well, you have to get it from the laborer, well, it's getting blood from a stone, like there's nothing to take. And yet you signed a contract with, the company to do the work, and then they damaged your property. So.
Right. And to what extent is the customer going to be held liable? What if the customer hires a non-bonded, non-insured person to do the work, and it's hazardous work, and there's potential for error? Under what conditions can the customer be held liable for the fact that someone working out of his apartment ends up damaging an adjacent apartment?
Yeah, because you went for the lowest bidder and you got what you paid for.
That's right. So the halacha had said, let's just review what the Rav Shulchan Aruch, what we were talking about over here, is that that you are the Rav Shulchan Aruch was talking about things that you're not allowed to do b'dinei shamayim, even though b'dinei adam you may be held patur, but b'dinei shamayim what you're doing is truly wrong, is truly morally reprehensible. If, let's say, you go to a non-Jew and you tell him that he's overpaying by patronizing your competitor, so you can't be held liable legally for just saying lashon hara, but what you've done is truly evil. And also another example is that if a person is trying to evade a debt, and you as a fellow Jew are trying to get the Jew who's trying to evade his debt into trouble, and even though what you're doing is not called mesira, because you're not actually causing the person to give up and relinquish more than what he's obligated to relinquish. And again, of course, he doesn't have money, so he'll have to sell his house, he'll have to give up his assets, and so forth, or borrow money from others. We call makom ra'a gedola asa, but you're still doing an act of evil by causing your friends to go into financial ruin. He says, "Va'af sha'avkas halva'asa masur kishesh chilul Hashem mikol makom zeh she'en lo onesu." And even though you might want to argue that you're trying to avoid a chilul Hashem because this Jew is failing to make good on his obligations, but nonetheless, by getting him in trouble and implicating him in trying to evade his debt is causing him to go into financial ruin, and he doesn't have the money, and you're causing a tremendous upheaval in his life, and therefore what you're doing is evil. B'chol hagorem nezek lachavero. Whenever you do a causative act to cause damage to your friend, afilu be'inyan shepater midinei adam, even in instances where you will be held pater in a mortal court, chayev b'dinei shamayim, you can still be held liable in a heavenly court. In other words, God will still hold you responsible for doing an act of evil. So chayev b'dinei shamayim, what does the Likutim say? Ve'ihavi safek b'nezikin b'makom sheyesh chiyav latzes yidei shamayim nami chashuv iser lechatchil. Even if there's a doubt whether such an act is considered to be injurious to a person, if you want to do the right thing, you have to avoid entering into that doubt, even though the worst you'll be chayav for is the dinei shamayim and not the dinei adam. Okay, I'm going to skip the last one, but we didn't really finish all of the text of the Imrei Yaakov either. So we should really go back to the Imrei Yaakov. Okay, we really do have to go back and finish the Imrei Yaakov. Okay. He says over here when he says the reason why what you're doing is evil, when you know that a fellow Jew is trying to evade a debt and you end up squealing on him, is if he truly doesn't have the money, you're causing him to go into financial ruin, and therefore what you're doing is wrong. And even though the guy may be committing a chilul Hashem, but the fact of the matter is, even though he is committing a chilul Hashem, but there's no other options for this guy other than to go into complete financial ruin. Now, we had seen that one of the things that you're not allowed to do is to cause damage. If Shimon goes ahead and tells the non-Jew that he's being ripped off by Reuven, so that's aser b'dinei shamayim. What you've done is something that is truly evil, but you cannot be held liable. And the Imrei Yaakov just qualifies that. He says, "Aval im ha'emes eino imo." If what Shimon says is not true, and Reuven is not ripping him off, but Shimon is misrepresenting the facts, the hamekach shaveh kamo sheReuven machro, and that Reuven is charging a reasonable price for the merchandise, uba Shimon v'amar lenachri she'eno shaveh kol kach, and Shimon really tells a falsehood, and he says that Reuven is overcharging him. V'hanachri machzik hamekach la'atzma b'koach. And let's say there are repercussions. Let's say the Gentile, in his indignation, goes ahead and refuses to pay the bill that Reuven had, the invoice that Reuven had sent him. And he says, "I'm not paying this bill. I've been told you've been ripping me off for years for this merchandise. So I'm not paying you." So now the question is, can Shimon be held liable in this kind of situation, not only b'dinei shamayim, but even b'dinei adam? There are opinions which state that in this kind of situation, Reuven can actually take Shimon to Beis Din and say that based on Shimon's false report about him to his customer. The customer has now refused to pay, and I want damages from Reuven for having caused me, Shimon, real damage. Now I'm out of pocket. So the Efshar, the Hava Kimasur, and it could be that he has the din of a Masur also. But in a scenario where the Gentile returns the merchandise or pays the invoice, even if Reuven, if let's say the Gentile returns the merchandise and says, I don't want your merchandise anymore, you've been ripping me off based on Reuven's reports, okay? Or let's say in his scenario, it's Shimon disparaging Reuven's merchandise and saying that that the goy was getting ripped off from Reuven's merchandise. Even if Reuven will have to now turn around and resell the merchandise at a lower price, Ein Shimon chayv l'shalim l'mashe. In that scenario, Shimon cannot be held liable to pay him, even though Shimon was lying. Shaharei eno machasro klum, daharei kibel b'chazara et mekcho. In that scenario, Shimon cannot be held liable because Reuven really did get his merchandise back. Now, it's true that because perhaps the merchandise is not as high in demand, or because perhaps it was lingering too long in the possession of the original Gentile purchaser, that Reuven now is going to have to take a loss on the merchandise, but at least he's gotten his merchandise back, and Shimon therefore cannot be held liable. But of course, a lot of it will depend on the circumstances. What if it's a seasonal item that the Gentile had purchased, and by the time he returns it, it's lost its value? And obviously, that's going to play a role in determining the damages. Ra'a Gedola Asa. So Shimon has done a truly evil act. Yesh Omer Mishum Dahabale Kameshiv Aveda La'akum Da'asr Kedisa B'Sanhedrin. So, well, it's not clear why Shimon has done such a terrible thing when he's told the truth. When he squeals and he tells the Gentile customer that that you're getting ripped off from Reuven. Just trying to look at the Shar Hatzion. Right. I mean, part of the evil that Shimon has done is even though he's saving the Gentile money, but he's doing it at the expense of a fellow Jew, and that's the part that's really considered to be the wrong here. It's none of your business, and you should not be volunteering this kind of information. And I'll leave it at that for now. But if the Jew is doing something truly wrong, and his wrongful act will be discovered as a Chilul Hashem, so then there's nothing wrong with revealing that, the fact that a Jew is committing a Chilul Hashem, even revealing that to the authorities, if all they will do is obligate him to pay what he owes, right? And the only time that you're not allowed to reveal to the authorities or to anyone else that a person is evading a debt is only when you know for a fact that the guy really doesn't have anything to his name to pay, except for his basic assets, which he'll have to be rendered homeless or rely on community charity because of the fact that you've exposed him. Okay, and that will be that's the evil that you're doing if you know the guy doesn't have. But let's say you know the guy has money. Let's say he's a very well-off balabas and he's committing tax fraud. Then and you know that the Chilul Hashem will eventually be exposed. So then sometimes there is a mitzvah to expose that person in order to avoid the Chilul Hashem. he says, and that's what the Imrei Yaakov says over here. Aval im yesh lo l'shalem b'kachilul Hashem, v'rotza livroach, shari mi'ikar hadin legalosa. You would be permitted, depending upon the scenario, whether it's appropriate to do so or not is controversial. But let's say the fellow who's committing the Chilul Hashem and is trying to evade his debt is going to eventually be exposed. You feel it's going to be a big stain on the Jewish community. So then you would be allowed to report him to the authorities in order to avoid creating a bigger Chilul Hashem. And this is where a lot of people get the term Masira wrong. And I'd like to follow up with this tomorrow, Mirz Hashem, and talk about this a little bit more, because there have been a lot of accusations, especially during COVID, about Jews acting as massers, right? Because some people were complaining to the authorities when schools were kept open against provincial and Board of Health rules, and people were accusing them of being massers, right? And it's clear that when there's a Chilul Hashem involved, you're not a maser. So we'll talk about that in Mirz Hashem tomorrow. Okay.
Maybe tomorrow we can also address whether that reporting minimizes the Chilul Hashem, because it sounds like you're exposing as you speak. So does it reduce the ultimate Chilul Hashem by doing so, or
well,
not?
that's